Okay.
Okay,
Thanks everybody for turning up again, and welcome back to Paul, who's going to give us a talk about your constitution today.
good. Thank you, Peter, for setting this all up, and welcome everybody. This first slide is rather awe-inspiring, but we have to do it for the sake of our anxiety levels. So, look, I'm talking about constitution, and what is constitution? Constitution is basically your makeup, as it has finally constituted itself in early adulthood. And the constitution is the result of your genes. At least half the story are your genes, and the way your genes have interacted with the environment while you're growing. So it's your genes plus things that happen to you in the womb, things happen to you in your early feeding environment, things happened to you in your exposure to the environment and microorganisms and other things as you were growing up. Your constitution is going to be different. For example, if you grew up on a farm and if you grew up in the inner city, there's going to be a certain tweaking to your genes as a result of that. And finally, you arrive in early adult life with these physical influences in your past, psychological influences in your past, and you're landed with a particular constitution. The predominant factor, however, what we will consider today is your constitution, basically from a genetic point of view, and the fact that constitutional types have been divided into three types by a number of different medical systems, both modern and traditional. I'm going to be focusing on one particular constitutional type today, the so-called Vata type in Hindu medicine, Ayurveda, or the ectomorph in Dr. Sheldon's classification, or the thyroid type in Dr. Beeler's classification from back in the 1940s. But first of all, I want to tell you the story of how I got interested in the idea of constitution, which medicine never talks about these days. They talked a lot about it in former times, basically until the modern era of pharmaceuticals. Then with all the so-called modern miracles of medicine, the idea of constitutional type just fell into misuse, lack of use. So my story, which some of you have heard and will think, oh my God, he's not going to tell you that story again. But for those who have not, I think it might be helpful. I don't know. But look, back in the late 70s, I got interested in nutrition. And when I came to Australia in 1980, I got seriously interested and thought, well, look, I need to really see what nutrition does for me personally. I've got to experiment with myself. And I'd read Dr. Richard McCarness's book, Not All in the Mind. Richard McCarness, some of you will know the name, a British psychiatrist who was influenced by a group of American doctors who started putting people on elimination diets. And that was back in the 1940s. So-called Stone Age diets, which eliminated modern foods, and had miraculous results in many conditions and in many individuals. McCarness replicated those early experiences in his psychiatric practice in the National Health Service. And he found that putting people on a Stone Age diet, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment, often produced incredible results in psychiatric patients, both in the neurotic sphere of mental illness and in the psychotic sphere of mental illness. So I thought to myself, look, I'll experiment with Richard's diet. Luckily, I got to work with Richard a few years later, but that's another story. So I put myself on a diet of lamb, rice, and a selected number of vegetables and one fruit per day with green tea. So eliminated basically milk products, gluten-containing grains, modern foods, caffeine-containing foods, and alcohol. Now, I had been blessed with chronic acne well into my 30s. I had all sorts of treatments, buckets of antibiotics, ultraviolet treatment, topical treatments, etc. Nothing really produced the goods. After 2 weeks on this elimination diet, my skin completely cleared up and became less greasy. I then introduced various foods and found that if I ate gluten-containing grains, heavy milk products, chocolate, one or two other things, then my spots came back. I've eliminated those foods ever since. So that's over 40 years ago, and I've never had spots again. That made a dramatic impact on me, as it must. You experiment with something and you get rid of a chronic condition. Well, you're convinced. So I thought to myself, look, wow, if an elimination diet can do that, then if I really go into the whole idea of dietary therapy even more intensively, I shall be a perfectly blissfully happy and radiantly healthy human being. So I started experimenting with fasting, juice fasts, and the kind of diets propounded by the likes of Dr. Bircher Benner in Switzerland and the Eplams in Scandinavia, who all advocated basically vegetarian diets, raw food diets, juice fasting, etc. So I did that for 2 or 3 years. Basically, at the end of 2 or 3 years, my health was not good. I was underweight, cold all the time, chronically miserable, with no energy. So, of course, my wife Philomena knew very well that I was kind of crazy with this diet thing, and I should just go out and have a steak. But of course, I needed convincing by someone else, and I went and saw a particularly well-known naturopath in Melbourne who did the iridology. He looked at my eyes and he said, "You've got to eat some meat." And so I ate meat, and gradually over maybe 12 months, recovered some of my health. This made me think, well, what's that all about? So I realized that it was something about my constitution. This particular diet that I was on obviously created miraculous results for some people, but were terrible for me. So what was it about me or my constitution? And basically, I discovered there was a lot of literature about this. First of all, there was the literature of Dr. W.H. Sheldon, a doctor and psychologist again from the 1940s and 50s, who examined literally thousands of people in a very systematic way and realized there were 3 broad types of people: ectomorphs, anxious, skinny, low energy types; mesomorphs, robust, muscular, athletic, confident types; and endomorphs, people who were prone to overweight, but a very stable disposition, very sociable, but who could not afford to have too much fat or carbohydrate in their diet. And I realized that I was a particular type, an ectomorph, an anxious, thin individual who needed a robust diet to support what was basically a sensitive physical and psychological constitution. And I realized that my neuroses, my anxiety, and my lack of energy were very much a constitutional fact. I was a person who was basically born not a muscular, robust, athletic type full of confidence. That was me. That was my constitution. And it had a downside, but it also had an upside. So I started to eat on the recommendation of these pioneers of constitutional theory in medicine, like Dr. Sheldon, Dr. Beeler, and others who recommended, for example, my type needed to eat a high protein diet, not too much in the way of carbohydrates or refined carbohydrates, and to basically have a diet that was supportive of the problems of their constitution. So that's where we'll start today. And I'm going to concentrate on that particular constitution because that particular constitution is more prone to chronic illnesses. It is more prone to allergies, chronic fatigue, and infections, chronic infections. And maybe that will resonate with some of you. So, Peter, if we could have the first slide. Now, you won't probably be able to read this very well, but this is this is a summary, which is in my book, Hawk Stubbs and Other Humans, of the 3 types, according to Ayurvedic medicine, Hindu medicine. Because I discovered that these Western pioneers of constitution, of course, were way behind. In Hindu medicine, this classification had been valid for years, hundreds of years, and it had been used as the basis for therapeutics in Ayurveda. It guided dietary advice about sort of yoga and meditation practices that people should undertake, and the herbs and other strategies that they should use to regain their health. Now we're going to concentrate on the Vata constitution, which is Sheldon's ectomorph or cerebrotonic constitution. And in Hindu medicine, Vata types are lean. They have basically low stamina, poor circulation. They're often cold all the time. They don't sweat much, which is a clue to this particular constitution. Brittle nails, crooked teeth, because they don't have an enormous amount of jaw development. So their lower incisors, like mine, tend to be crooked. Menstrual irregularities in women. They like the heat. They don't like the cold. They're not great sleepers. They are prone to chronic anxiety. They need lots of physical touch because, as you probably know, the skin is the royal road to the nervous system. The skin and the brain develop from the same embryonic tissue. So if you want to communicate with the brain, the best thing is to do so through touch. And ectomorphs respond very, very well to massage, not heavy massage. Nothing must be too heavy for them. So they can't overdo it with exercise. They need routine. They should not fast. And next slide, thanks, Peter. So here we go. They've got to be careful with their digestion. So they need a good breakfast, substantial breakfast. They should avoid too much caffeine and certainly avoid sugar. They should tend to avoid wheat. Rice is their best grain. Bread, tend to avoid, please. Vegetables, cooked things. Because their digestion is not so strong, it's best to cook everything. You know, give your digestion a chance. This particularly applies to Vata types, not to Pittas. Pittas do very well with raw food because they're fiery, whereas Vatas are just quite airy. They don't have much fire. So they've got to be aided with heat. Legumes, no, sorry. Digestion, be careful with legumes if you're a Vata type. Often need flesh foods. And Ayurveda, which, and of course Hinduism is traditionally vegetarian, but they will recommend lamb in particular for Vata types because they know this is the one constitutional type where you can break any rules and provide meat, because that is so supportive for Vata types, particularly in winter because it's a very warm food. Salt they need. Oil is okay, the right sort of oils, and garlic and ginger agree with them particularly. So I place a great deal of store in the recommendations from Ayurvedic medicine. There are many other recommendations for Vata types. And a very good book for recommendations is Deepak Chopra's book, Perfect Health. Look, I don't agree with some of the things that Deepak Chopra has written about, but his book, Perfect Health, is an excellent summary on the Ayurvedic take on constitution. And the stuff on the Vata type is very good. So Ayurveda has very good recommendations, and they gel very accurately with the more recent findings from the nutritional pioneers like Dr. Beeler, Dr. Tintera, and others from the 1950s and 60s who did this early work on constitution. So let's move on to the next slide, thanks. Now, let's look at some people with regard to their constitution. The interesting thing about constitution is that, and the ectomorph constitution or Vata type in particular, is that, of course, it goes with a particular temperament. And Sheldon called the thin, anxious ectomorph the cerebrotonic because they tended to be sensitive individuals who thought a lot and thought, in a deep way. Basically, they tended to be introverts who were sensitive to other people, sensitive to the suffering of the world as well as themselves, and who thought deeply about things. And were often, humanitarians. And so I put together some ectomorphs for us. So Bob Brown, wonderful guy, of course, very sensitive guy, but he's got a fire component in him as well, because, he got out there and really did a lot of stuff and had to be reasonably robust. But the giveaway for ectomorphs is the long, slim face, the long, thin face. They have long, thin faces and long fingers. And somebody may look robust in other features, but if they've got a long face and long artist's fingers, then they've got a strong ectomorphic component. Let's have the next one. Kate Blanchett is somebody else who's clearly ectomorphic, and she's got an ectomorphic body build as well. And she's chronically thin. Next one. I don't suppose everybody would know who this chap is. Does anybody want to cut in and say who it is? If we were all together in the same room, I'd be offering a substantial prize along the way for, identifying these unusual people, but unfortunately we can't do that. Well, it's Bertrand Russell. the famous philosopher and humanist and idealist. Clearly super ectomorphic, an academic, a thinker, and a humanitarian. Next one, thanks. Rowan Williams, ex-Archbishop of Canterbury, very ectomorphic fellow, a philosopher. Don't know how he ever got to be Archbishop of Canterbury because they don't like thinkers in the Church of England. But he's super intellectual and wonderful philosopher. So press on. Now, Nicole Kidman, a classic ectomorph, thin, sensitive individual. Here she is playing another thin, sensitive individual, Virginia Woolf. And of course, Virginia Woolf had some of the mood problems that ectomorphs often have. Ectomorphs tend to have a mood which is a little bit below par. And in extreme cases is very much below par, and they get quite marked depression. But the natural setting for an ectomorph is to be a little bit below par, 1 degree under. I never bounce out of bed feeling that, the wonderful day is before me, all the wonderful things I'm going to do. It's more like, yes, well, it's another day, and here we go. Press on, Peter, thank you. Now, the classic ectomorph in literature is Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes, as depicted in Conan Doyle's books, is the classic ectomorph. He's an introvert. He's always depicted as having a long, somber face. And he's a thinker. And when he's not able to think, he goes into black despair. And of course, needs a stimulant, notably cocaine, and backed up with tobacco to get him out of it. Or basically, he needs a problem to solve. So he's an ectomorph with what we would call a systematizing brain. And he is always portrayed, except in the most recent Sherlock Holmes film, as ectomorphic. So this is Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes. Press on. There he is with his companion Watson. Watson is always portrayed as a completely different type. Watson, as you know, was a practical guy. He was ex-army, very down to earth, not very imaginative, but a doer. You know, when Sherlock Holmes was doing something risky, he'd always tell Watson to bring his gun along. Watson could be relied on to back you up, but he was not a big thinker. Press on. Now, there is the definitive Sherlock Holmes, Jeremy Brett, many TV series in which he played Sherlock Holmes. And he is the absolute best, most definitive Sherlock Holmes. And if you've never seen Sherlock Holmes with Jeremy Brett in it, you're missing something very wonderful. Press on. There he is with his Watson, again, someone portrayed with a square face because they are practical, down-to-earth people. Press on. Jimmy Lee Miller, not such a great Sherlock Holmes, but he's still got a long face, and his companion has still got a rounder face. Press on. Benedict Cumberbatch, same deal. And Benedict Cumberbatch, of course, often plays a more cerebral type of person. He seldom plays someone who's the life and soul of the part. He plays people who are introverted, more thoughtful, sometimes eccentric. Press on. And of course, the ultimate ectomorph, Jesus is always portrayed as ectomorph. I don't know about the blue eyes. But yes, Jesus is portrayed as ectomorphic because spiritual people in the West are often portrayed as ectomorphic because the ectomorphic type has a natural spiritual disposition. Because they are introverted and because they are affected by the sufferings both that they experience and which they experience in others and in the world, they are troubled by their sensitivity to the world. They're in the world, but not quite of it. And the world often seems to them to be an oppressive, difficult place. And so they look to a different realm, the spiritual realm. So they are naturally spiritual people because they are sensitive. Press on. Let's start by talking about this disposition from a physical point of view. There are various biological challenges which face the body. They are sensitive over all the interfaces that their organism has with the environment. All the membranes which interface with the environment are sensitive. The skin, so they're more prone to eczema, for example. Mucous membranes, they're more prone to allergies, asthma. Gut, they're more sensitive to gut problems. The gut lining doesn't work tremendously well. All the membranes in ectomorphs are somewhat porous. They're permeable. And so this is why we have problems with allergies and absorbing things and keeping things out. And that is mirrored, as we will see a little bit later on, in their sensitive psychological boundaries, which are also porous. This is the great virtue of the sensitive ectomorph, that they are sensitive to their environment. And to be sensitive to your environment, you have to let things in. You have to be porous. More of that later. They have poor rhythmicity. Their natural biorhythms are weak. And we were talking last time about the fact that it's so important, particularly if you're a Vata type, to set your clock properly in the morning. Food, movement, and exposure to natural daylight. They did an experiment many years ago now at Melbourne University. They were looking at biorhythms and the relationship of how strong your biorhythm was to your psychological temperament. And they measured the biorhythms by monitoring temperature over 24 hours. You know, the temperature goes up and down in a very regular way over 24 hours. So they administered a psychological questionnaire to a bunch of medical students who they paid, small amounts of money. Medical students will do anything with small amounts of money, and had them lying down in a bed for 24 hours while their rectal temperature was monitored by a rectal probe. I don't know how much they got paid, but you only paid a little bit for doing that. And they found that those who scored higher on anxiety, on an anxiety scale, had weaker biorhythms. That is, the ups and downs, the smooth up and down of their biorhythm was shallower than in less anxious types. So they have naturally poor rhythm. So it's always going to be a problem for them if they break their biorhythm through air travel, through late nights, etc. Bathers also have a characteristic immune response. They are prone to food sensitivities and allergies. They are atopic, so they're prone to hay fever, asthma, eczema, other allergies. And that is absolutely related to their poor or more porous boundaries. But also it relates to the fact that they run high stress hormone levels. And high stress hormone levels are not so great for your immune system. They have large surface area to mass ratio. If you're thin, your surface area in relation to your total mass is greater than if you're more robust. So you lose heat more easily. So your metabolism is going to work harder to keep you warm. That's why if you're an ectomorph, you tend to get cold all the time, particularly obviously in the winter and in less warm climates. Because they're anxious, they run higher cortisol levels, the chronic stress hormone. That has a number of metabolic effects. It's not good for building up muscle, for building yourself up. You know, there are catabolic effects where your body breaks down, and there are building up effects where your body makes new tissues, builds up muscle, repairs. Cortisol is very bad for that balance. It tends to make the body break down, and it doesn't help the body to build up. And that probably is the major thing in the ectomorphic constitution, which really upsets the apple cart. And it's why relaxation and stress management is absolutely the first priority for all people with a Vata disposition. Absolutely the first priority. They also have a reduced fat mass, which means they don't have much in the way of reserves if they get ill. First of all, they don't have so much insulation, so that doesn't help with keeping warm. But if you get seriously ill, you rely partly on your fat reserves. You don't have much in the fat reserves. That's not such a good situation. That's why if you're thin in later life, it's not such a great idea. And it's why people who are a little bit overweight do better in old age, because they've got a bit of padding if they fall over, and they've got a much better reserve if they get ill. Press on. So the way we think about, stress, the environment, diet, and whatever, is the simple way, of course, that our ability to handle stress is like a container, and the problems we encounter, which put a stress on our adaptation capacity, is like filling the container with water. And as long as the water level is below the height of the container, we're managing. As soon as a number of factors combined to make the container overflow, we get illness. And the major factors are, of course, infections, dietary factors, particularly nutritional deficiencies, allergens, toxins, and most importantly, psychosocial stress. And by the way, the other thing about not having enough fat is that fat is a great store of toxins, as you know. The body doesn't know what to do with a toxin. You can't excrete it fast enough. It shoves it off to the fat stores. If you're ectomorphic, you can't do that. You're just stuck with the toxin. You've got to deal with it in the here and now. which may explain why ectomorphs tend to be more sensitive to environmental toxins. Next one, thanks. Let me give you an illustration about diet and toxins and whatever through this case history. This is back in the early 90s. Robin's a 25-year-old woman with a 7-year history of paranoid schizophrenia, so somebody with a severe illness. She has a low IQ. She lives in a community hospital and takes an antipsychotic medication. She's had a lot of hospital admissions. She also has eczema, irritable bowel, and repeated ear infections. There's a history of ear infections and eczema from childhood. She has seasonal rhinitis and extreme sensitivity to insect bites. She is thin with delicate bones and a long face. Her appetite is very robust, and her favorite foods are sweets, ice creams, and pizza. Pretty typical for Vata types who love carbohydrate because they're constantly looking for something to stoke up their fires. Now, as soon as I saw Robin, I thought, terrific. She's ectomorphic. She's got all of these signs and symptoms of the ectomorphic or Vata constitution. Allergies, in particular, history of ear infections, eczema, irritable bowel. That's something which Vatas get a lot, and an addiction to carbohydrates. We'll put her on a diet, an elimination diet of lamb, rice, some vegetables, a little bit of fruit, and wheat, black, or green tea. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about Robin was that she kept a diary. Next one, please. When I saw her first, and this was just before Christmas in 1991, obviously, this was a typical diary entry, which she kept regularly. She went on the diet. Her parents took her back home, and her mother did the diet with her, so really created an incentive and support. So, next one, please. After she'd been on the diet for a relatively short time, 2 or 3 weeks, this was the quality of her diary entries. And then when she'd been on the diet a little bit longer, next one, thanks, that was the quality of her diary entries. So it's very clear to see that her brain cleared. Her brain cleared. And although her psychosis did not completely disappear, it was dramatically better and remained better for all the time for many years I followed her up afterwards. And she was very good because she realized, wow, that diet, I need to be off those things that were poisoning me. And we found, not surprisingly, that when we challenged her with various foods after this period of elimination, the usual suspects, milk products, gluten grains, and a few other things. Interestingly, pineapple caused her ear pain. Her mother was doing the diet as well. Pineapple caused her mother ear pain as well, although her mother did react to the other foods that Robin reacted to. So that was kind of interesting. And a vivid illustration of what you can do with an elimination diet and how beneficial that can be, particularly in a Vata constitution where there's a lot of reactivity to things like grains, milk products, and some other things, in this case, like pineapple. Next one, thanks, Peter. This is a little cartoon for your edification. Many years after my experience with acne, this research appeared, which, not surprisingly, showed that refined carbohydrates, etc., were not good for acne because they stimulated insulin, and insulin is not good for inflammation. Many years after my experience, I took my younger daughter to see a dermatologist because she developed quite severe acne, and I thought, well, I'll do the right thing. I'll just get the conventional medical model before Dad puts in his two penneth worth about going on an elimination diet, because it's always a treacherous thing to put early adolescent women on a diet of any sort. So I walked in the door with my daughter to the dermatologist. Before we sat down, I kid you not, she read my referral letter, no doubt. She said, well, of course you know that acne has nothing to do with diet. Well, I was totally flabbergasted. I should have left then, but we didn't. We pressed on. But all we got was the conventional take. It was extraordinary to me that at that stage of our knowledge, a consultant dermatologist should be so keen to tell us that diet had nothing to do with acne, when it was the common experience of millions of acne sufferers over the years that some things flared up their acne. Mind-boggling. Press on, Peter. I won't dwell on this, actually. A very key substance for Vata types is the amino acid glutamine, which some of you may be taking for irritable bowel or bowel problems. It is a key substance which regulates many things, many systems, which are a little bit wobbly in Vatas, and can be a useful thing to take, but there are real downsides to it as well. So let's pass over that just and press on. This is the current consensus food pyramid, basically. But before this pyramid came in, I don't know, about 30 years ago, the conventional wisdom for many years from the authorities, the researchers, the university institutions, and the medical institutions was that the bottom of the pyramid was a lot of carbohydrate. The top of the pyramid was a little bit of fat and some protein, but not very much. And after 20 years of research, they realized that this diet was no good for people. They're recommending a lot of carbohydrate, complex or not, had not improved people's health. And they realized that the missing ingredient was for oils. So they put in more oils at the base of the pyramid, and they made sure they put in enough fish, poultry, and eggs to boost up the protein a little bit. And they made sure that people knew that refined carbohydrates like white rice, white bread, potatoes, etc., were at the top of the pyramid, and it was the low glycemic carbohydrates that were the go, and for people to avoid high glycemic carbohydrates like rice and white flour products. Next, that conventional diet looks something like this. There's a lot of carbohydrate. Good fats are fairly minimal. There's only 15% of protein, which is the conventional wisdom, obviously, about how much protein you need. That's 15% of your calories as protein. A rough calculation is 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight. But that is not good for Vata types. That's fine for Pittas, for fire types. but not for Vatas. Next slide, thanks. This is more like it. This is Barry Sears' Zone diet. The Zone diet was very popular about 20 years ago. Barry Sears wrote a lot of books about diet. I like them and use them a lot. This is more like it for Vata types. The good oils, up to 30%. Good proteins, lean proteins, up to 30%. Not protein from vegetable sources so much. They just can't deal with it. Just can't deal with it. End of story. Asians can. If you've got an Asian genetic background, you can extract amino acids from vegetable protein sources much more easily than if you say you had a European background. These are the kinds of proportions in a zone favorable diet. And I recommend still that people look at the zone diet, Barry Sears' zone diet, and have a look at it and see what they think. Next slide, thanks. This is a kind of zone-friendly diet. You know, you have some eggs for breakfast. That's always been recommended by other constitutional practitioners, medicos. Eggs in the morning, as long as you don't have, you know, too many cholesterol or triglyceride problems or whatever. Eggs in the morning are good. They set you up for the day. Then you have some protein at lunchtime. And you have protein again at tea. And look, you're having healthy accompaniments to that. And really, you're looking at something like a Mediterranean diet with an eye on the fact that you're getting plenty of olive oil and plenty of fresh foods. And the Mediterranean diet, and I won't go into that, we will talk about diet maybe some other time. Mediterranean diet is a very good starting point. And kind of molding your Mediterranean style diet with those kind of proportions recommended by Barry Sears in the Zone diet. And you can get his little book, A Week in the Zone, to get a feel for the sort of diets that he recommends. Next slide, thanks. Now, this isn't a zone-friendly plate. It looks pretty good. You've got tinned salmon, which is really the best sort of salmon unless you're getting the wild-caught New Zealand salmon. If you took out a little bit of rice and you took out most of the carrots, because they're, of course, very high glycemic vegetables, you'd have and put a bit of olive oil on the vegetables, you'd have a bit more of a zone-friendly plate. That's erring a bit on the high glycemic carbohydrate side. Okay, press on. Now, we talked about rhythmicity and the importance of biorhythms for the Vata type. So it's very important. Here's the normal, so-called ultradian cycle. The body gears us up for action for a couple of hours. It's actually a bit more than 90 minutes, I think, for a couple of hours. And then it gears us up for a little bit of a rest so the body can recoup on a psychophysical basis, psychophysical recuperation. And that goes on during the day. So it's very important to take these little breaks. Very important. And if you override any breaks which your body needs to do, you've got to pay the penalty sooner or later. Now, you may be able to make it up with a little nap after lunch. Press on. Next slide, thanks. Here are the cycles going on during the night and during the day. They're compressed in the night, but they correspond with the REM cycles, the dream cycles, and then you get the deep sleep cycles where the body is regenerating and recouping. Press on. Now, I can't quite read. We're missing a little bit on the right-hand side here, but I'll read it out. You must sleep sometime between lunch and dinner, and no halfway measures. Take off your clothes and get into bed. That's what I always do. Don't think you'll be doing less because you sleep during the day. That's a foolish notion held by people who have no imagination. You'll be able to accomplish more. You get 2 days in one. Well, at least 1.5, I'm sure. When the war started, I had to sleep during the day because that was the only way I could cope with my responsibilities. Winston Churchill, of course. And Winston Churchill was always a very, very high energy pitta type, very strong pitta type. Action, confidence, physical work in the world. And, he was one of those strange characters like Harold Macmillan, also a British Prime Minister, of course, after the war, who actually enjoyed being in the First World War. Churchill had a great time. So did Macmillan. Both very robust fire types. Whereas ectomorphs would spend, a month at the front and have to be retired from post-traumatic stress disorder, or shell shock, as they call it. That rest after lunch is worth its weight in gold. If you work through lunch and you don't have that rest and you're a Vata type, you will pay the price as night follows day. I know that sounds a bit grim, but it's true. If you've got a Vata component. Now, if I should say here, but of course, we're all a mixture of types. There are very few pure types. I'm almost purely Vata. So that's why I kind of know about that condition. But most people are mixtures. But they have a predominant dosha, as it's called in Ayurveda. One of the traits is dominant. So if you have a dominant trait of Vata, and that usually manifests as emotional sensitivity, then you've got to be rhythmic. You've got to have rhythm. And if you get ill, it's absolutely invaluable to take that rest after lunch. Press on. Next slide, thanks. Oh, look, we're running out of time. It's a loony cartoon about how grim things can seem in the middle of the night. Very characteristic for Vatas. Wake up in the middle of the night, all is doom and gloom. And often it doesn't look so great when you wake up in the morning. So the Vata type is slow to get going. But by lunchtime, they may be in a reasonable mood. So pressing on. Now, the interesting thing is that another way of looking at Vatas is that they have permeable psychological membranes. That is, their minds don't compartmentalize things so well as some other types. Particularly, they don't compartmentalize between the thinking part and the feeling part. And they don't compartmentalize so well between the systematizing activities of the left brain and the empathizing and intuitive capacities of the right brain. Press on, Peter. This chap, Hartman, did some research, and I'll read it out because it's just so fascinating. Hartman describes an investigation with 866 people who completed his boundary questionnaire and were categorized according to their total boundary scores. His research then compared the 20 people who scored highest for thin boundaries with the 20 who scored highest for thick boundaries. The thick boundary group consisted of 6 women and 40 men whose occupations were skewed towards business, law, and engineering. The group did not contain a single teacher, health or human services worker, or anybody connected with the arts. All members of this group seemed normal and fairly conventional and reported very little dream recall. The 20 thinnest scorers within this group were, as we might expect, very different indeed. There were 17 women and only 3 men, and the group contained no lawyers, no engineers, no business executives. 4 of the group were homemakers, 3 were teachers, 2 were artists, and the rest were one of a kind, for example, nurse, laborer, or counselor. Recall of dreams was very high, and none of the individuals struck investigators as conventional or perfectionistic. I did a little survey of my client base a few years ago, and this is what my client base consisted of. Not totally, but just as a representative sample. Clinical psychologists, psychotherapists, housewives and mothers, gardeners, artists, teachers, writer, nurses, secretaries, IT consultant, and a carpenter. This speaks volumes, and it's a whole topic in itself, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the right and the left hemisphere of the brain, which is a super interesting topic. The Vata types have thin mental boundaries. That means that they are emotionally sensitive. They're sensitive to the suffering of others. They have vivid awareness of their dream lives and what's happening in their bodies. And that vivid awareness of what's happening in your body can be good, but it can be a real disadvantage, because that combined with anxiety means you can become preoccupied with physical symptoms and aches and pains and things you don't understand that are happening in your body. Next one, Peter. There's some very good books on the Vata constitution. They're not called the Vata constitution, but they're about this sensitive type of individual. The best one is Elaine Aron's The Highly Sensitive Person. Next one, thanks, Peter. Are you highly sensitive? Here's some of the very classic kind of symptoms and signs which she thinks mark out the sensitive person. You're very sensitive to the environment. You're affected by others' moods. You're sensitive to pain. You have to withdraw periodically into bed or a darkened room or any place where you can have some privacy and relief from stimulation. You're sensitive to caffeine. You're easily overwhelmed by sensory stimulation. You have a complex or rich inner life. You don't like loud noises. You're moved by the arts and music. You're conscientious. You startle easily. You get rattled when you have a lot to do. You're sensitive to other people's uncomfortable feelings. You don't like doing many things at once. You tend to avoid making mistakes. It makes you anxious. Violent movies, the news, etc., often disturb you. Next one, thanks, Peter. You're overstimulated when a lot's going on around you. You're very sensitive to getting hungry. Life changes shake you up. You enjoy fine scents and sounds, works of art. You have to be regular. You don't like you have performance anxiety. And when you were young, you were possibly labeled as sensitive or shy. Next one, Peter. Elaine Aron's written other books, The High Sensitive Person at Work, The High Sensitive Person in Love. This is quite a good book because, next one, Peter. Oh, this is a cartoon for your edification. We shall be finishing in a minute. I'm sorry to be going on so long, but we'll carry on for another 5 or 10 minutes if I may. This is my favorite therapy cartoon. For those who can't read it, the psychiatrist is sitting behind the couch, of course. On the back of the couch, it says, if you weren't listening, say yes, go on. If you couldn't care less, say, how do you feel about that? The psychiatrist saying, oops, how do you feel about that? So, that's a very cynical view of therapy. Press on. Great book. Too Loud, Too Bright, Too Fast, Too Tight, where she talks about the sensory defensive syndrome, people who are sensitive and spend their lives basically not getting overstimulated, with a lot of recommendations about what to do. Press on. Quiet, Susan Cain's book on introverts. Excellent book. Next one, thanks. Advantages for highly sensitive couples and disadvantages, challenges. I won't go into that now. That's a whole other subject. Press on. Benefits and challenges for highly sensitive person in relationship with a non-highly sensitive person. So these interesting dynamics, they each have advantages and disadvantages. We won't go into that now. Press on, Peter. These are very important guidelines. Do not allow if you're a sensitive individual, do not allow yourself to consistently work above your energy budget. Don't get tired. Do not allow yourself to be promoted into a position where you will have to work above your stress tolerance, even though it seems attractive. These are the temptations of fortune and fame. Be careful. When you're exceeding your energy budget, deal with your over-responsibility and perfectionism and delegate. That is our control freaks, because the world is always a little bit overwhelming and they have to control everything. Be aware of that. Always appreciate your worth and do not allow yourself to be exploited. Don't allow people to drain you because you are a good listener. That is a sensitive. They want to listen to people, and they appreciate their suffering or their problem or whatever. But it's very draining, as people with chronic fatigue know. The most draining thing you can do if you've got chronic fatigue is listen to somebody. And you know, the world is full of pittas and kaphas, and they all love to talk. Extroverted. The kapha is socially extroverted. The pitta is physically extroverted. So you're surrounded by people who want to do things and people who want to socialize with you and bend your ear. Be very, very careful. Do not let yourself get pushed around. Be appropriately assertive. If you want to get on in your organization, take a deep breath and do some occasional schmoozing. Participating in a little harmless gossip will also be good for your group membership credentials. You got to play the game a bit in the workplace. And you're not naturally sociable, and you're not naturally a gossip. Sometimes you have to play the game. Next one, thanks, Peter. This is a prize-winning photograph of 3 sleeping dormice. Remember, sleep is so important. Sleep. Sleep after lunch, if you can, or at least rest. And sleep at night. Go to bed the same time every night. Get up the same time every day. Do your time givers. Food, movement, light. Next one, thanks, Peter. I think we're already there. Now, of course, again, a prize would be available for who guesses who this is. Of course, no reason why anybody should recognize Emily Dickinson, the famous American 19th century poet, the classic highly sensitive person, very ectomorphic, as you can see. It's like that long face. You can see she's an introvert just by looking at her. She was very socially phobic and just spent most of her life in a room writing, occasionally venturing forth, but not liking it very much. And next one, and the real Virginia Woolf, again, a classic ectomorph, highly sensitive person, and manic depressive. And of course, we know she killed herself in the end. And one more slide, Peter, and we're done. Just a summary on some of the physical aspects for ectomorphs, that is, highly sensitive people, Vata types. Remember, stress is helping to break your system down. Your system has difficulty in building itself up. So you've got to do everything to build yourself up. stress management is the most important thing, and try and put on a bit of weight. In your nutrition, you generally need more of everything. You need more amino acids, i.e. more protein, more essential fatty acids, more minerals in particular, because you don't absorb them very well, and sometimes some extra vitamins. Protein, trace elements, and antioxidants are very important. My view about the antioxidants is not so clear these days, but protein and trace elements absolutely. Have some help with digestion. Digestive enzymes are often very helpful. Use massage and tactile therapies to help calm your system, and exercise with caution. A general rule: don't do more in an exercise session that you wouldn't be able to do easily the following day again. That's a bit of a harsh rule, but at least that you wouldn't be able to do in a couple of days' time. That's me. Now, maybe we've got an opportunity to have a question or two. I'm not quite sure how we're organized on the electronic front today. Peter, what do you reckon?
Well, we can stop the video share and we can have some questions. This is still being recorded, which would be nice to get some questions in and some of your answers as well. So we're back.
Okay.
Anybody got any questions they'd like to do? If they want to put it in the chat, they're welcome to. We have got some questions who came through, or some comments as well from somebody. I'm happy to read that out if the person would like to.
Good.
And another question down the bottom. All right, let's do that. I'll read out from someone on the something about an ectomorph, but when this person was living in mould, they put on over 20 kilos, and it was explained to them that their body was holding on to a lot of fat in order to store the toxins in the fat cells because the body couldn't cope with them all.
Yeah.
So they don't live in mould anymore, and the excess weight came off. So that could be hiding with a lot of people as well, myself included, who's put on a lot of weight, and probably because they're toxic. Is that something that, an ectomorph could initially start out that way, but then gain a lot of weight, and its reason being is because they're very, very toxic?
Yes, it could be. I mean, look, of course, if you're reacting to something, the most likely explanation you're putting on weight is that you're retaining fluid, because you are in an inflammatory state, and inflammation causes fluid retention in certain circumstances. But I think the putting on weight. Look, there's so many different factors involved in putting on weight. If you're a pure ectomorph, you can never put on weight. It's almost impossible, unless there's something else going on, like a toxin. Yeah.
And you did say that people quite often have a mix. Nobody's exactly really pure.
No one's a pure mesomorph or ectomorph or endomorph. I mean, there are exceptions. Like Winston Churchill, he was almost in his heyday, when his younger years, he was almost pure fire type or mesomorph.